The police found Julian Vance on the kitchen floor with a lighter in one hand and a burner phone in the other, his brother Elias standing over him with a pistol, and the family estate burning down to ash in the records office. None of them would leave that house the same way they came in. 13 hours earlier, Julian had been arranging trophies. The mahogany bookshelf stretched from floor to ceiling, a monument to accumulated mediocrity and genuine achievement, stacked side by side like lies and truths waiting to be sorted. Julian's right hand gripped a dusty trophy. Second place, Regional Science Fair 2008. And he worked at a stubborn smudge on its base with a yellow microfiber cloth. The rhythmic squeak of fabric against metal filled the quiet evening, punctuated only by the soft hum of the floor lamp, casting its beam across dust motes that danced like tiny suspended worlds. His mother, Eleanor, entered from the left, moving with the practiced grace of someone who had never doubted her own elegance. She wore a silk emerald blouse that caught the light, and her eyes moved directly to his hands, to the trophy, to the arrangement of the bookshelf. Without a word, she reached out and adjusted his collar with fingers that were cool and precise. Then she reached for the trophy he was holding, his trophy, and shifted it 2 inches to the left. Behind it, she positioned the larger, gold-plated one labeled Elias Vance, valedictorian. The edge of Elias's trophy caught the light and cast a clear shadow over Julian's silver one. "We must have everything perfect for Elias," Eleanor said, her voice bright with a practiced excitement that never quite reached her eyes. "It's been 3 years since his last promotion." Julian's jaw tightened. He could feel the muscle working beneath his skin, could feel the words piling up in his throat like a dam of unsaid things. He said nothing. He simply lowered his gaze to his shoes and watched as his mother turned and left the room with the kind of smooth exit that suggested she had forgotten him the moment she turned away. When she was gone, Julian walked to the window and pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket. The debt notice from the local bank was creased and worn, stamped across the front in letters so red they looked like blood. "Overdue." He rolled it into a tight cylinder, his knuckles going white as the paper compressed. Outside, the gravel driveway lay empty and waiting. The sound came without warning, the scrunch of tires on gravel, the mechanical growl of an expensive engine being cut to silence, the sharp click of a car door closing. Eleanor clapped her hands together with a sudden, theatrical energy that seemed to come from nowhere. Julian's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, the envelope disappearing back into the darkness there, as if it could be unmade simply by being hidden. He stood absolutely still, listening. Headlights swept across the living room walls, and the ordinary evening turned theatrical. The front door opened, and Elias entered, as if he were walking onto a stage designed specifically for his arrival. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Julian made in a month. And his dark hair was swept back with the kind of precision that suggested either obsession or a complete indifference to whether things mattered. Julian could never quite tell which. He dropped a designer leather bag on the floor with a heavy thud that echoed through the foyer. And he opened his arms for Eleanor in a gesture that was simultaneously warm and calculated. But his eyes, those moved directly to Julian and held there, glittering with an emotion that looked like triumph. "Still living in the museum, Julian?" Elias said, his voice smooth as oil. His gaze traveled slowly from Julian's face to the bookshelf and back again. "I see Mom still keeps my old trophies in the front row." The words hung in the air between them, like a challenge that didn't require an answer. That night, when the house had fallen into the kind of deep silence that only comes when families share the same roof but not the same world, Julian found himself in the kitchen. He was pouring water from a stainless steel pitcher, the glass filling with a soft, gurgling sound, when he saw Elias through the patio door. His brother stood in the shadows beyond the glass, and in the darkness, his face was illuminated only by the blue glow of a phone. Not his usual corporate mobile with its sleek black case, but something smaller, something disposable. The burner phone looked obscene in the refined setting, like a weapon disguised as nothing at all. Julian froze with the glass half full. The water continued to pour, running over the rim now, soaking his fingers, and he didn't move. Through the slats of the patio blinds, he watched Elias's lips move, watched the intensity in his brother's shoulders, watched the way his hand clenched and unclenched at his side. Whatever was being said on that phone was not the kind of conversation meant for family ears. He set the glass down on the counter without a sound and slid the glass door open. The hinges protested with a rattle, and Elias spun around as if he'd been caught committing a crime. His hand moved with reflexive speed, jamming the burner phone into his suit jacket pocket in one fluid motion. The casual grace of the gesture suggested practice. Julian stepped onto the stone patio, and the door clicked shut behind him. The distance between them compressed immediately into something tense and dangerous. "Who are you talking to?" Julian asked, his voice low and careful. "That's not your work phone." For a moment, Elias simply stared at him. Then something cruel settled across his features, a smile that had nothing to do with warmth. "Mind your business, little brother," Elias said, each word laced with venom. "Go back to your failures." Julian reached out, his hand moving toward the pocket where the burner phone had disappeared. He didn't have a plan beyond the reach, didn't know what he would do if he actually succeeded. But the instinct was pure and immediate. Grab it. See what secrets were being kept in the darkness of his own home. Elias moved faster. His hand shot out and caught Julian's wrist, twisting it downward with a practiced violence that suggested this, too, was not his first rodeo. Pain lanced up Julian's arm, sharp and bright and immediate. Julian bellowed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere primal and deep, and he used his free hand to shove Elias hard in the chest. His brother stumbled backward, and the wrought iron patio table caught him squarely in the spine. He hit it with enough force to knock the air from his lungs, and the iron scraped against the stone with a sound like a death rattle. But Elias recovered quickly. He lunged forward, driving his shoulder into Julian's gut like a linebacker, and Julian's breath left him in one catastrophic rush. The stone patio came up to meet him, and the impact of his back against solid earth sent a constellation of pain through his spine. Before he could gather his senses, Elias was on top of him, pinning him down with a forearm pressed against his throat. His brother's face was inches from his own, teeth bared, eyes blazing with something that looked like pure animal instinct. "You touch me again, and I'll tell Mom you've been stealing from her," Elias hissed, his breath hot and close. "I know about the debt, Julian. I know about every fucking penny." He held the pressure for 5 more seconds. Long enough for Julian's vision to start swimming, long enough for him to understand that Elias could crush his windpipe if he wanted to. And then he released. Elias stood up, brushing dirt from his expensive sleeves as if the violence had been nothing more than an irritation. He walked back into the house without another word, and the glass door clicked shut behind him with a note of finality. Julian lay on the cold stone for a long moment, unable to move, unable to think of anything beyond the next breath. His fingers, still tingling with the shock of impact and restraint, scraped against the stone. And then they found something. A rectangular piece of plastic, smooth and cool and absolutely wrong. He pulled it closer, his vision still swimming. A key card. White plastic with the gold-embossed logo of the Grand Horizon Hotel, and beneath it, printed in neat blue letters, Room 402. He lay on his back under the stars with a dead man's keycard in his trembling hand. Late that night, when the house had fallen into the kind of silence that preceded confession or catastrophe. Julian made his way to his father's study. He used his phone's flashlight to navigate the darkness, the circular beam moving across leather-bound volumes and the accumulated dust of a man who had been dead for 3 years, but somehow still commanded the space he had occupied. The oak desk dominated the room like a monument. Julian moved to it and pried at the bottom drawer with a flathead screwdriver he'd taken from the garage, his hands shaking slightly as he worked the blade into the seam. The wood splintered and resisted and finally surrendered. The drawer popped open, and inside, under a stack of old tax returns, under insurance policies and property documents, sat a sealed medical envelope. His father's name was written on it in official print. Julian's hands moved automatically, tearing the envelope open with a violence that seemed to belong to someone else. The lab report was dated 3 years ago, the week his father died. The week of the car accident that no one had ever really explained. Julian shined the light on the results and saw the word at the top, underlined and capitalized. Toxicology. His eyes moved down the page, parsing the chemical names and percentages that swam before him in the darkness. High levels of arsenic. Numbers that meant death. Numbers that meant intention. Below the clinical data, in the flowing cursive of his mother's handwriting, a note. Keep this from the boys. For their own good. Julian dropped the paper on the desk. He stood very still, his breath coming in short, precise gasps, and tried to process the fact that his father had not simply died. He had been poisoned, that his mother had known, that his mother had hidden it, that his mother had decided, with the kind of cold calculation that most people reserve for business decisions or menu choices, that it was better to lie than to tell the truth. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside the study. Julian moved on pure instinct, showing the papers under his shirt, pressing them against his skin where they felt like ice. He turned off his flashlight and stood in the pitch darkness, every muscle clenched, barely allowing himself to breathe. Outside the study door, a shadow moved across the sliver of light that showed beneath the frame. Slow, methodical footsteps, each one deliberate and careful, as if whoever was walking knew exactly where they were going and why they were going there. Julian stood motionless in the darkness for 3 minutes that felt like hours. The footsteps continued on, moving further down the hallway, and eventually faded into the distance. He exhaled very slowly. He realized, standing there with his dead father's toxicology report pressed against his chest and a hotel keycard in his pocket, that his entire life had been built on a foundation of corpses. The competition between him and Elias, the constant measuring of worth and achievement, had all taken place in a graveyard. And he wasn't simply a witness to what had happened. He was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming dangerous. The following morning arrived with a kind of cruel clarity that only comes after a sleepless night. Julian showered and changed into clean clothes and drove to the Grand Horizon Hotel while his family slept, the stolen keycard burning like a secret in his pocket. The hallway on the 4th floor was aggressively plush. Thick red carpet that swallowed sound, gold-trimmed mirrors reflecting his image back at him with accusatory precision. He wore a hoodie pulled low over his face, the posture of a man trying not to be seen, as he made his way to room 402. The keycard worked exactly as it was designed to work. The electronic lock beeped softly and flashed green, and the door released with a whisper of expensive mechanics. Julian entered. The room was a landscape of chaos. Files were scattered across the bed in no particular order, papers overlapping and bleeding into one another. An open laptop sat on the desk, its screen dark but still warm. Miniature liquor bottles, the tiny kind that came with miniature shame, lined the nightstand like a confession written in glass. And there, sitting half open on the floor near the window, was a large black suitcase. The lid was propped back, and even from where Julian stood, he could see the edges of money. Stacks of it. Bundled $100 bills in neat, geometric formation. Julian took a step toward the suitcase and then froze. A man stepped out of the bathroom, not small, not threatening in the abstract sense. Threatening in the way that physical reality is threatening when it's directed at you with clear intentionality. He was massive, wearing a gray tracksuit that hung over muscle like a skin, and his face was the kind that had been rearranged by violence so many times that the original structure had become a suggestion rather than a fact. In his hand, he held a heavy brass lamp. There was no greeting, no warning. The man simply swung the lamp at Julian's head, as if this were the most natural conversation in the world. Julian's reflexes, sharpened by years of his brother's violence, by a childhood of constant threat, sent him diving low. The lamp whistled through the space where his head had been and shattered against the door frame with a sound like an explosion. Glass and brass went everywhere, spinning through the air like shrapnel. Julian didn't think about it. He simply moved, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection and tackling him backward into the dresser. Bottles of expensive perfume hit the floor and shattered, sending up a cloud of artificial flowers and broken dreams. The man was stronger and heavier, but Julian was younger and desperate. They grappled in the chaos of the room, knocking over furniture, creating a symphony of destruction. The man managed to wrap his arm around Julian's neck and began to squeeze, cutting off airflow with methodical precision. Julian could feel his vision starting to tunnel, feel the pressure building behind his eyes like water behind a dam. He drove his elbow backward into the man's ribs, felt the solid connection, felt the arm loosen just slightly. That was enough. Julian twisted free and grabbed a heavy glass ashtray from the nightstand. He didn't hesitate. He swung it with all the force he could muster, and it connected with the side of the man's head with a sound like a bell being struck underwater. The man's eyes rolled back, and he dropped to the floor, breathing but unconscious, a thin line of blood trickling from his temple. Julian stood over him, gasping, his entire body shaking. He could taste blood in his mouth, his own or the man's. He couldn't tell. He looked at the silver pistol that was sitting on the nightstand, exactly where it had been a moment before, waiting like a patient house pet for someone to pick it up and finish the job. "Who the hell are you people?" he whispered to the unconscious man, to the room, to himself. His hands were shaking as he opened the laptop. The screen bloomed to life, bright and accusatory. He didn't need to find his password or anything else. The computer was already logged in, waiting for him like an invitation. He scrolled through the browser history and found emails between Elias and a development firm called Vanguard Holdings. Emails that grew increasingly frantic as they went backward in time. He found a PDF titled Vance Estate Transfer. His thumb moved over the trackpad with the precision of someone performing surgery. The document opened, and there it was. The family home, rendered in legal language and digital text, being transferred as collateral for debts. Debts incurred by Elias. Gambling debts, according to the notations. And the signature on the witness line was his mother's, Eleanor Vance, written in that same flowing cursive that had appeared on the toxicology report. The date on the document made his stomach drop. Yesterday. Below the legal language, an email thread. A message from Elias to someone at Vanguard Holdings. Property to be vacated within 48 hours of final payment. Don't worry about Julian. He's a loser. He won't even notice until the locks are changed. Julian read those words 3 times, 4 times. Each reading added weight to the reality that was settling around him like snow. His mother hadn't just poisoned his father. She had engineered the future of his life. She had decided, cold and clear, that he was disposable, that his opinions didn't matter, that his existence was an inconvenience to be worked around rather than a life to be honored. The money in the suitcase sat in the darkness like a lie. Julian reached over and opened the case fully, pulling out one of the stacks of bills. He looked at them carefully, letting the light from the laptop screen play across the surface. The texture was wrong. The color was slightly off. He bent one of the bills, and it cracked instead of folding. White paper inside. Counterfeit. Every bill, every stack, all of it was nothing but elaborate theater. A stage prop, a set piece for a play about an inheritance that had never existed. Julian looked at the silver pistol sitting on the nightstand and picked it up. The weight was familiar, despite everything. He tucked it into his waistband and grabbed the laptop with his other hand. He took the suitcase as well, leaving the unconscious man on the floor beside the shattered glass and the lingering smell of expensive perfume. He walked down the hallway of the Grand Horizon Hotel without looking back, and no one stopped him. No one asked questions. He simply walked out into the daylight with proof of deception in his hands, and returned to the only home he had ever known to confront the woman who had built her entire life on lies. The living room was bright with midday sunshine when Julian arrived. His mother was sitting on the sofa exactly as he had seen her in 1,000 other moments. Perfectly composed, perfectly arranged, perfectly false. She was drinking tea from a fine china cup, the porcelain so delicate it looked like it might shatter if spoken to too harshly. Julian threw the laptop onto the coffee table with enough force to make Eleanor flinch. "Look at the screen, Mom," Julian said, his voice steady despite the rage moving through his body like electricity. "Elias sold the house, and you signed for it." Eleanor didn't look at the screen. She simply set her teacup down on its saucer with a delicate clink, a sound like a period being placed at the end of a sentence. She looked Julian in the eye, and the expression on her face was something between pity and contempt, an emotion that existed in the space between two people who no longer shared the same reality. "Elias is moving us to the city, Julian," she said, her voice stripped of any pretense of warmth. "Into a penthouse. You were never part of the plan. Your baggage." The words landed like physical blows. Julian pulled the toxicology report from his pocket, the paper still slightly crumpled from being hidden against his skin. He slammed it down next to the laptop, and Eleanor's eyes flickered, just for a moment, just for the fraction of a second. But it was enough. It was enough to confirm that she knew exactly what it was. "And this?" Julian demanded, his voice rising. Did Dad want to move to the city too? Or was he baggage? Eleanor stood up with the kind of slowness that suggested she was rising to her feet in a room without gravity. She walked toward Julian, and he stood his ground despite every instinct screaming at him to move. She stopped inches away from him and reached out, her hand stroking his cheek with a touch that was cold and calculated. A mother's gesture rendered obscene by the context in which it was delivered. "Your father was a weak man who would have bankrupted us," she said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Elias is like me. You are just like your father. And we both know how that ended." The front door opened. Elias walked in, as if he had been waiting in the wings for exactly this moment. He took in the scene, the laptop, the toxicology report, Julian's bruised and bloodied appearance, the evidence of their entire conspiracy laid out on the coffee table like an indictment. His hand moved to his waistband, and a black Glock appeared as if by magic. He pointed it at Julian's chest. Julian didn't run. Somewhere in the calculation of escape routes and survival probability, he simply accepted that running wasn't an option. Elias gestured with the pistol toward the back door, the one that led to the yard, to the shed, to places where screams wouldn't be heard by neighbors who were already suspicious, but not suspicious enough. The woodshed behind the house was a place that had existed on the periphery of Julian's entire life. He had played there as a child, built forts from stacked wood, buried treasures that he sometimes tried to find again. It smelled of pine and gasoline, of entropy and decay, of all the things that didn't fit in the main house, and so were relegated to this liminal space at the edge of the property. Elias pushed him inside, and Julian tripped over a stack of logs, falling into a heap of sawdust that rose up in clouds of dust and history. The door slammed shut behind them, and Elias slid the wooden bolt into place with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Light came through the cracks in the planks, thin, harsh lines that cut the darkness into segments. "Pick it up," Elias said. And Julian realized his brother was holding the heavy iron splitting maul that hung on the wall. Elias tossed it toward him, the iron head hitting the dirt with a sound like a muffled scream. "Let's see if you have any of Dad's weakness left in you." Julian lunged, but not for the maul. He drove at Elias's knees, and they went down together in a tangle of limbs and desperation. The Glock went off. A sound so loud it seemed to belong to a different universe entirely. A reality where physics worked differently and air itself could rupture. The bullet splintered a roof beam above them, sending down a rain of sawdust and wood. They rolled through the debris, locked together in an embrace that was more violent than any love, and more intimate than any friendship. Elias smashed his forehead into Julian's nose, and bright pain exploded behind his eyes. Blood sprayed, hot and arterial, and Julian felt himself falling back. Elias grabbed a length of heavy chain from a hook on the wall and whipped it at Julian's back. The chain connected with a sound like the world cracking, and Julian screamed. A sound that came from somewhere primal and ancient and completely honest. Through the haze of pain, Julian saw the gasoline can sitting in the corner. He moved without thinking, his hand closing around the metal, his body moving despite the agony in his back and ribs. He hurled the can at Elias's head. His brother ducked, but the cap came loose, and fuel sloshed across his expensive suit, soaking the charcoal fabric until it was dark and dripping and alive with possibility. Julian fumbled in his pocket for the Zippo lighter he'd taken from the desk earlier, just in case. Just because a man in possession of secrets learns to keep tools on him. They stood facing each other in the dust and gasoline fumes. Breathing hard, the equation of their lives suddenly and completely simplified. Julian opened the lighter. A small flame flickered into existence, fragile but absolutely real. Elias stood 5 feet away, dripping with fuel, the Glock still in his hand but lowered now. A weapon made useless by the fact that pulling the trigger would simply add another fire to the situation. "Drop the gun, Elias," Julian said, his voice steadier than any voice had the right to be. "Or we both burn." Elias began to laugh. It was a sound without joy, a sound that belonged to something broken and aware of its own brokenness. He reached into his wet pocket and pulled out one of the $100 bills from the suitcase. He held it up to the light streaming through the cracks, and Julian could see that something was profoundly wrong with it. The color was off. The texture was wrong. The paper seemed to have a whiteness to it that real money didn't possess. Elias tore it in half. It was white paper inside. Absolutely, completely, certainly white paper. "It's prop money, Julian," Elias said, still laughing that terrible, broken laugh. "You stole a suitcase of trash. The real money is already in a Cayman account in Mom's name. She set you up. She knew you'd take the suitcase. The debt collectors are coming for you because the suitcase they find in your car will be the proof you stole from them." In the distance, Julian heard sirens. They started quietly and grew louder, their walls cutting through the afternoon air. Elias took a step toward him. Despite the flame, despite the gasoline, despite the obvious equation that even a child could solve. "Just like the car accident," Elias said, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "That's how she does it. She sets it up so that it looks like you are always the problem." Julian looked at the lighter in his hand. The flame was still burning. He looked at his brother, who was still coming toward him. He looked at the shed around them, the wood, the gasoline, the history of their shared childhood rendered into kindling. The sirens got louder. Outside the woodshed, Elias's words became almost prophetic. Blue and red lights began to reflect through the cracks in the planks, painting the interior of the shed with the colors of emergency. The door was kicked open with a violence that sent it crashing backward on its hinges. 3 police officers appeared, their rifles drawn and pointed with the kind of precision that comes from extensive training. They screamed at Julian to drop everything, to get on the ground, to make himself small and compliant. Julian was holding the lighter and a knife. When had he picked up a knife? He didn't remember picking up a knife, but there it was in his hand, real and dangerous and impossible to explain. He dropped both. Elias immediately dropped his gun and put his hands up, and his face transformed into an expression of pure fear and victimization that would have been Academy Award worthy if there had been cameras. But there were only officers, and they tackled Julian with the kind of efficiency that came from clear protocol and no ambiguity about who was guilty. His face was pushed into the sawdust and gasoline, the mixture going into his mouth and up his nose, burning and choking. He felt the cold metal of handcuffs snapping onto his wrists with a finality that seemed absolute. Elias stood by, being comforted by another officer, whispering urgently, pointing toward the house. Eleanor appeared at the edge of the police line, and she was wearing a pashmina around her shoulders despite the warm afternoon. She looked at Julian with an expression of staged heartbreak, and she gestured toward his car, which was parked nearby. The officers moved toward it immediately, already knowing what they would find, already acting out a script that had been written long before this moment. An officer opened the trunk and pulled out the suitcase. He popped the latch, and the fake money spilled out across the grass like leaves, like confetti, like evidence of a crime that had been carefully constructed to look like something Julian had done. The officer looked at Julian with pure disgust. A man surveying a particularly revolting specimen of human failure. Julian was dragged toward the police cruiser. He looked back at the house one last time, at the Victorian mansion that had been his entire world. And he saw Elias and Eleanor standing side by side, 2 silhouettes of a perfect family framed against the darkness of the entryway. He was thrown into the back seat and the door was slammed shut with a sound like an ending. The holding cell was small and gray, and it smelled of industrial cleaners and the despair of people who had made mistakes that could not be unmade. Julian sat on a concrete bench and didn't move for hours. But eventually, after the initial processing had concluded and the officers had left him alone, he pulled something from the lining of his shoe. The burner phone he had managed to swipe from Elias on the patio before everything had fallen apart. He didn't call a lawyer. He navigated instead through the phone's security with the kind of methodical patience that came from knowing how these things worked, from understanding the logic of code and encryption and the way that people made passwords out of things they thought were random but really weren't. His skill from the science fair, the one that had earned him second place while Elias got trophies, turned out to be useful after all. He found the voice memos. He found the file labeled The Plan. He played it. It was Elias's voice and Eleanor's voice, having a conversation that was never meant to be heard. Eleanor was discussing the arsenic, discussing the property transfer, discussing the arrangement of events that would lead to Julian's incarceration. And then she said something that made the entire case crystallize. The property transfer is the last step. Julian takes the fall, we take the city, just like the car accident. 4 words spoken with the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from complete moral clarity in the wrong direction. Just like the car accident. Julian knocked on the bars. The officer came, the same one from the woodshed, the one who had tackled him into the gasoline and sawdust. Julian held up the phone. "I have something you're going to want to hear," Julian said, his voice steady and clear. "And once you hear it, I want my brother and mother in the room across from me." The interrogation room was lit by an industrial ceiling fixture that made everyone look slightly ghoulish. Elias and Eleanor sat across from Julian, separated by a metal table that had probably seen 1,000 moments like this. Confessions and accusations and the slow crumbling of carefully constructed facades. 2 detectives stood in the corners, observing, recording, bearing witness. A detective placed the burner phone on the table and pressed play. The recording filled the room. She simply looked at both of her sons with an expression of utter contempt, the kind of look that belonged to someone surveying insects. She reached for her purse, but a detective stepped in and moved it away before she could reach it. Julian stood up. He walked toward the door, and no one stopped him because there was nothing to stop. The machinery of law enforcement had already begun moving in a different direction now, churning toward Eleanor and Elias instead of toward him. He stepped out into the hallway, and it felt like coming up for air after drowning. 1 week later, Julian stood on the porch of the Vance house for the last time. The home was sealed with police tape, and the investigation was ongoing, and the machinery of law was working through its processes with the kind of methodical slowness that it reserved for cases involving mothers who poisoned fathers and sons who aided in fraud. A duffel bag sat at his feet. He had packed it that morning with the things that mattered, which turned out to be surprisingly few. In his hand, he held a photograph. It showed a young Julian and Elias playing together in the yard, before the rivalry had calcified into something that couldn't be healed, before the family had become a collection of people living in the same house, but in different moral universes. He looked at it for a long time. He flipped it over. On the back, in his father's handwriting, it said, "To Julian, my bravest son, you don't need to be first to be whole." Attached to the back of the photo with careful tape was a small key to a safe deposit box. One his mother had never found, one his father must have arranged to be given to him after whatever was going to happen had happened. Julian held the key up to the light. It was silver and small, and had the kind of weight that came from being given by a man who loved you. Even if he couldn't stay to see you become the person he believed you would be. Julian dropped the photo and the key into his duffel bag and zipped it shut. He walked down the stairs, stepping over the police tape as if it weren't there. His feet found the gravel driveway, and the sound of his footsteps crunching on stone seemed impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon. A taxi waited at the end of the driveway, its engine idling with a patient rumble. He stopped at the mailbox before getting into the car. There was a letter there, addressed to him in the clinical typeface of an official document. He opened it. It was from a DNA ancestry site. He had taken the test months ago, during one of those moments when he thought that understanding where he came from might illuminate who he was. The results showed that Julian Vance was not biologically related to Eleanor or Elias. The cover letter explained it carefully. There had been a prior marriage, before Eleanor, a woman who had died in childbirth. That woman had been Julian's true mother, and his father had loved her with the kind of intensity that only comes once in a lifetime. Julian was the product of that love, which meant that he had never truly been part of Eleanor's family at all. He had been an outsider from the very beginning, which explained, in a way that seemed almost too neat and too perfect, why Eleanor had always treated him as if he were someone else's obligation.